Well, it's a real honor to be here in Oregon again. I started out here because I clerked for Judge Goodwin at the Ninth Circuit in Portland right after I got out of law school. I fell in love with this place. And in fact, Derek Bell offered me a position to teach here at this law school when I was just beginning law teaching. The only problem was that they only needed a teacher of corporate securities law, and I didn't know a damn thing about it. And so I had to tell Derek, I'm sorry, but they're going to let me teach human rights and international law and, would you believe, contracts at Washington and Lee. I had taken contracts and actually knew something about it because Antonin Scalia was my professor. Anyway, it's really good to be back because, as I say, we fell in love with Oregon. I even learned how to pronounce the word. And it's also really an honor for me to be here where Paul Slovic has done so much of his pioneering work. You will see a picture at the end of this presentation, and I won't give you any more hints. But you'll see a picture that will bring to your minds why that has been important to me. His work has really delved into why it is that we as human beings seem to have such a hard time identifying with the suffering of large numbers of people who are all the way around the world. Or for that matter, even large numbers of people who are right next door in our own country. It's an amazing problem. It seems to be true that people are able to respond to individual suffering, that when you present a person who is suffering, they will do a lot of amazing things to help that person. But when you produce a genocide, when 800,000 people are murdered in Rwanda, our government, even under a very good administration, I say that because I work in the administration, the Clinton administration, will withdraw, actually lead the charge to withdraw all the UN troops from Rwanda that could have saved so many hundreds of thousands of lives. Why do we do this? It is an amazing problem. And so Paul has done some of the basic research to try to understand this really haunting problem about human nature. What I want to do today is talk to you about how we can prevent genocide and do so in a structured way, because a lot of times people think genocide is just some kind of a catastrophe like an earthquake, or a volcanic eruption or a tsunami, and you can't really see it coming. We know that there are risk zones, yeah, sure. We know there are volcanoes there, and we know that maybe there are fault lines in the Earth's surface and so forth. But it's pretty hard to predict those kinds of disasters. Well, the thing is about genocide, the more we have studied it, the more we now realize that it is very predictable, and that it actually follows a very predictable pattern. It's very predictable process. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. So tonight, the talk is about 10 ways to prevent genocide. We're going to begin this series on the prevention initiative that Jane Gordon and others here are beginning at this university, and I'm so happy that you're doing it. We need it everywhere. And here you are, once again, as usual, in Oregon, pioneering. It's always been a pioneer state, and it still is. First of all, let's define the term. What is genocide? Well, under the International Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which was adopted by the UN in 1948, the definition is that genocide means any of the following acts, and get this, committed with intent, it has to have intent, to destroy, it has to destroy, in whole or in part, don't ever forget the in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Notice there's 4 different kinds of groups here that are especially protected. National, ethnical, racial, or religious groups. Now, Genocide Watch doesn't limit our concern to just those 4 groups, and I'll tell you why. Because Raphael Lemkin, who was the father of the Genocide Convention, would have also included political, economic, social, and cultural groups. Guess why I was taken out of the convention? Guess who was on the Security Council at the UN in 1948? Think about it. One of the members happened to be the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union didn't exactly want those groups included in the Genocide Convention. They had a feeling they might just be guilty of that. And so they didn't put them in. However, we believe they should have been put in. And in any case, those crimes are still crimes against humanity. If you try to exterminate, a cultural group or a social group or an economic group, it's still a crime against humanity. These are the acts that define genocide. Do you remember during the Rwandan genocide when they refused to say it was genocide? For 3 months, our State Department lawyers said, oh, no. There may be acts of genocide, but it's not genocide. Well, this is how stupid they were. The truth is, genocide is actually defined in terms of acts. Acts of killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group, and finally, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. By the way, the United States has not exactly got clean hands on this, as you know. Our treatment of our Native American population, for example, clearly was genocidal. We definitely transferred children of Native American groups to schools where they couldn't even speak their own languages. That's genocide. We also physically wiped out most of the Indians, the so-called Indians, the Native Americans, in the whole eastern part of the United States, and even further west. So our history is genocidal, I'm sorry to say. If you read Robert Frost's famous inaugural poem at John Kennedy's inauguration, he directly acknowledges that. He says the land was ours before we were the land. The whole idea of manifest destiny is a genocidal ideology. So, coming to terms and being honest about our own history is something that I think is very important. Also, the Middle Passage during the slavery era was, I believe, genocidal, because every slavery ship captain knew that at least a third or maybe a fifth of his cargo, so-called cargo, human beings, would in fact die during that Middle Passage. If you know that, you know that's genocide. So, in other words, we don't have clean hands in this country, and we should never even presume that we do. When we realize that, however, it also makes us realize that we can see that this is a human problem. We shouldn't just point fingers at Sudan. We should be, in fact, pointing fingers at Sudan. We should be arresting Bashir right now because they are still committing genocide. But we should also realize that it is still a human problem. It's also our problem. These are some of the acts that are punishable. Genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide. You don't even have to have the genocide happen if you conspire to commit it. Direct and public incitement to commit genocide. Somebody going out and giving a speech saying, go kill all of those Tutsis, is actually committing the crime of genocide under the Genocide Convention. The attempt to commit genocide. Complicity in genocide. In other words, selling the arms to killers. That's a crime under the Genocide Convention. Well, as I said, Raphael Lemkin wanted to include other groups. economic, political, social, and cultural groups in the Soviet Union blocked that, and those are still crimes against humanity. So why do we still have genocide today, even though it's outlawed in 1948? Well, the basic problem is state sovereignty. Genocide succeeds when the state sovereignty blocks the international responsibility to protect citizens of genocidal states. The UN is an organization of states, not of peoples, even though its preamble starts out, "We the peoples." The truth is, the UN is an organization of states, and the states protect their own governments. And they've never wanted to have interference by an international organization in the affairs that occur within their boundaries. Since the founding of the UN, over 55 genocides have occurred, 70 million dead of their own government, and the problem has been, in other words, not solved. And we're going to just have to figure out how to solve it, because we don't yet have the international institutions to do that. So that's one of the things I'm going to talk about tonight. I also want to disabuse us of one misunderstanding that's commonly made, and that is that conflict resolution equals genocide prevention. Conflict resolution is often very important in genocide prevention. Conflict can lead to genocide. Conflict between Tutsis and Hutus and so forth. But there was no conflict between Jews and Germans. The Jews considered themselves to be Germans who were in Germany. The imagination of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis is what caused the Holocaust. They believed the Jews to be their enemies. But there wasn't truly a conflict between the Jews and the rest of Germans. So, in other words, conflict resolution would not have prevented the Holocaust. In that case, you had a one-sided mass murder that was committed because a totalitarian state took control of an entire country, in fact, of an entire continent. What do you need to prevent genocide? 3 things. Early warning, and this is a picture of Leon Mugesera, who in 1992 made a speech in Rwanda calling for all Tutsis to be returned to where they came from, namely Ethiopia, he said, by sending them down the Kagera River. In other words, killing them and letting them float down into Lake Victoria. That is called incitement to genocide. Secondly, you need rapid response. You've got to have some kind of international institutions to respond quickly to genocide, or else you're not going to have any way to stop it. Thirdly, you have to have courts for accountability. Now, at the beginning of the 1990s, we had no such courts. I remember when I took international criminal law at Yale Law School from here, John Mosca, I looked at the syllabus the first day I walked in, and it ended at Nuremberg. There were no such things as international criminal courts. The only thing we had, in fact, to go to at that time was the International Court of Justice, where it wasn't even a criminal trial, where you could take a case against another state for violation of the Genocide Convention, but that's all you could do. You couldn't actually put somebody on trial and go to prison for it. So we didn't have the courts. Beginning in the 1990s, with the Clinton administration, we began to construct those courts, and that was an incredibly important development. David Sheffer and others were the ones, Madeline Albright and a lot of other people, worked very hard to construct the courts that became the Yugoslav Tribunal, the Rwanda Tribunal, the Sierra Leone Tribunal, the East Timor Tribunal, and finally we got the Cambodian Tribunal. That's, by the way, how I got started on all this. People ask me, well, how on earth did you get interested in this subject? By the way, this subject is a total conversation stopper whenever you go to what do you do? Well, I study genocide. Oh, well. And head the other way, you know. And I can tell you that, you know, the big problem is that we don't have any of these institutions, really. We have no real authoritative international institution to predict it. One of the things we did manage to get, and this was an idea that I came up with in 2000, was a special advisor at the UN Secretary General on the prevention of genocide. We realized we needed that during the East Timor crisis in 1999 when we were trying to get it stopped. And we did get Australia to intervene along with other UN members, and they did stop it. But I can tell you, when I and other members of the International Campaign to End Genocide, which had just been formed, tried calling the UN to tell them, hey, you know, what are you going to do about these massacres in East Timor? It was like calling Ghostbusters. You know, who is there? Who do you call? And the answer was nobody was there. And so we realized we had to have someone at the UN, and now we have that. In 2004, Kofi Annan finally created that position. And so we now have a special advisor for the prevention of genocide. That was a step forward, but it's not good enough because it's not yet authoritative. The Security Council still doesn't necessarily believe it. And that particular position also is prohibited. I'm not kidding. Actually, if you read the Security Council resolution, it's prohibited from actually declaring that something is a genocide. That's sort of strange, ain't it? What they are able to do, though, and this has been very useful, is to go to member states of the UN to teach those governments how to take steps to prevent genocide. And the particular strength of the current special advisor, Francis Deng, who was the inventor of the responsibility to protect doctrine, is that he has really emphasized the prevention. He's made it acceptable for countries like Guinea and other countries that are really kind of at risk to accept delegations from his office to come and teach members of that government how to avoid falling into the trap of genocide. So that's been a positive development. But we still don't have a rapid response force. The UN has never implemented the articles in the UN Charter that would have created a UN command that could have, in fact, been a rapid response force. Articles 43 through 47 actually provide for it, and they've never, ever been implemented. That command has never been created. It's really kind of politically incorrect to talk about it, in fact, in the UN. Guess who's against it? Every one of the members of the firm 5 members of the Security Council. You know why? Because they have the power. And they really don't want the UN kind of button in on it. So we don't have that kind of special rapid response force yet. This is a UNAMIR peacekeeper in Rwanda. Rwanda is one of the cases where you actually already had UN peacekeepers on the ground at the beginning. And so what did the UN do? They actually voted to withdraw them. It's amazing. General Dole, who was in charge of UNAMIR, the UN forces, asked for reinforcements. He wanted another 2,500 men sent out there. We had 2,500 people there. They were lightly armed. He wanted reinforcements and much heavier armor. He also had a very sensible plan for protecting a lot of people's lives, protecting the stadiums and the churches where the Tutsis had gathered. It wouldn't have taken that many. But instead, what did we do? The U.S. State Department and U.S. National Security Council, the UK, France, the other firm 5 members of the UN decided instead to pull out decided to pull out everybody from Unimir. And then Ibrahim Gambari, the representative from Nigeria, said, wait a minute, you're spending billions of dollars in Bosnia. What's wrong here? Are African lives less valuable? And so Madeleine Albright, who I think was a very wise political person, said, well, I think we should leave at least 240. And so they took out everybody but those 240. But when the Ghanaian battalion got to Nairobi, after they cleaned them out, their commander was the deputy commander of Unimir, said, we don't want to leave. And they took a vote, and every single one of them voted to go back. And so they just turned the plane around and went back to Rwanda. And in fact, the result was that you had over 500 left. So at least the Ghanaians had the courage to stay in there and actually protect human lives. But we did not. As we said in the State Department at the time, I was in the State Department at the time, it was a, quote, non-starter. The word non-starter means we don't want to think about it. And every time I heard that word, I would always put up my hand and I would say, why don't we want to think about it? Because I knew that's exactly what it meant. Well, the reason we didn't want to think about it was it would have involved American involvement in Africa again. And it was only a few months after the Somalia mass killing of 18 Marines in the Black Hawk Down incident, if you remember that. Clinton didn't want any part of it. He was up for re-election in a few more months. He said, no more. We aren't getting involved. So they didn't. And so here we are. And this, my friends, is one of the all-time lows in UN history. This is one of the most shameful dates in UN history, April 21st, 1994, when the UN Security Council actually voted, you can see their hands up, voted to reduce the number of troops in Rwanda from 2,500 to 240. What was the result? And the reason, of course, was lack of political will to prevent it and to forcefully intervene to stop it. This is the result. Everywhere you go in Rwanda, there are these mass graves. 800,000 people died. We weren't willing to risk one of our soldiers. So this is the memorial now in Kigali to those people who died. And I've seen that same phenomenon in Cambodia. I've walked through the mass graves there. That's what changed my life, I can tell you. In 1980, when I was there, they had just opened up a number of mass graves. Now, everyone wanted to talk about the Khmer Rouge and what they'd done to their families. Everyone had lost members of their families. I came back to the United States, and I should have been the happiest man to face the earth. We had just adopted our daughter. I had a great career ahead of me. I was going to Yale Law School and so forth. Instead, I went into the deepest depression of my life. Finally, my wife, very wise and wonderful wife, said, you should go to see a psychiatrist. And she was right. And I went to a good psychiatrist at Yale Health Services, and that psychiatrist said to me, if you have seen what you have seen, and you weren't depressed, there'd be something wrong with you. And then that psychiatrist said something very wise also, said, some of us who have studied depression, and this was an expert, believe that depression can often result from repressed anger. What are you angry about? And I said, I am mad as hell that the Khmer Rouge have gotten away with mass murder. And that psychiatrist looked me in the eye and said, well, then what are you going to do about it? Now, this was right after my second year of law school, just before I was going into my 30s. And I started going around to talk to law professors about this. could actually be taken to the International Court of Justice. So why don't you go around to some human rights groups and see if they'll take it on? Maybe they would. So I did. I went around to all of them, pretty much. None of them would touch it. So I went back to some of these professors, and they said, why don't you do it? And I said, but I'm just a law student. This was the typical, what can I say, Ivy League arrogance. Because Michael Reisman, who was my professor of international law, responded to me, yes, but you're a Yale law student. Well, I don't tell my own students, yes, you're a George Mason student, or yes, you're a Mary Washington student. I just say, you don't have to wait until you're out of school to start changing the world. And that is the truth. It's the truth right here in Oregon. You can start changing the world right now. And I know some of you are already doing it. I was just in this pro bono ceremony here, and you are already changing the world, and I congratulate you on that. This was the call. I went to these professors. I had seen this mass murder, and finally I said to David Hawk, who helped me start this Cambodian Genocide Project, let's go to Cambodia and see if we get permission to carry out the investigations and, in fact, get this case brought to the International Court of Justice. And he did. We went in 1982. We got permission. There was an article about it in the New York Times. I got a call the next day from the Cambodian mission to the UN. We had it traced. And Chun Prasut, who was the Cambodian ambassador to the UN, he was Khmer Rouge. We were still voting to seat the Khmer Rouge in the UN. Can you believe this? And you know why? Because it was during the Cold War. And the government that had overthrown the Khmer Rouge was allied with the Vietnamese, who were allied with the Soviet Union, who were our enemy. And the friend of our enemy was our enemy. And so we were backing a tripartite coalition that included the Royalists, the anti-communists, and the Khmer Rouge. And guess which one would have dominated that coalition? I liken it to a coalition between a poodle, a collie, and a wolf. Well, it was crazy. The politics of the Cold War were crazy. But we finally, of course, realized after the State Department continuously tried to block a trial for you, the Khmer Rouge, that we had to somehow change American policy. So we formed a coalition to do it. This was in the 1980s. This is before I joined the State Department. And this coalition wrote a law, I wrote the law actually, and got Senator Robb to introduce it, called the Cambodian Genocide Justice Act. It would directly reverse American policy on trial of Khmer Rouge. And so we finally got it passed, but it was only passed after the Soviet Union fell. In other words, it took the end of the Cold War, the thawing of the frozen Cold War, for us to finally get that law passed and finally get the U.S. to change its policy on trying to Khmer Rouge. Okay. What I want to now do with you is go through the process of genocide, because understanding the process is a very big help in understanding how to prevent it. So first, let me explain to you a little bit about the origin of this. When I first started working on the Rwandan genocide in 1994 in the State Department, I realized very few of the diplomats understood even what genocide was. And they also had not studied it the way I had for so many years and didn't know that there was actually a predictable process. So I wrote a paper. It was a 2-page paper. I knew it had to be 2 pages or nobody would read it, because the attention span of the average diplomat is 2 pages. And so what I did is wrote a paper called The 8 Stages of Genocide that outlined what the stages of genocide process are. it became one of the most widely circulated papers in State Department history. And it also became circulated all around the world. It's become a paradigm all over the world. I mean, they painted it on the sides of schools in Northern Ireland, and it's in the curriculum of the primary and secondary schools in Rwanda. What I've realized, though, is actually it's not perfect. And so some of my colleagues have said, well, you know what, you need to add a couple more stages in there because, well, it's a little bit too rough the way you got it. So I have. So this is tonight, the unveiling of the other two stages as well. You're the first group to hear about the other two stages, and you'll see why I've added it. The first stage is classification. It's the us versus them stage. And it happens in all societies. It doesn't necessarily lead to genocide. It's because we as human beings have to classify the world. We see things around us and we say that's a strawberry and that's a grape. And that's a German and that's a Frenchman. And this is white and that's black and so forth and so on. We classify. It's natural to us. We wouldn't have language without it. The classifications that are important for genocide are nationality, ethnicity, race, or religion. That's the Genocide Convention. And for Marxism, the classification that's important is class. Class enemies are to be eliminated. That's why Marxism has actually killed far more people than any other ideological system. More than 4 or 5 times what Nazism ever killed. And also political groups. Many, many genocides or politicides have been carried out in the name of politics. Colombia, for instance, had la violencia for a long time between, would you believe it, the liberal and conservative parties. These weren't even Marxist parties. Bipolar societies like Rwanda are the most likely to have genocide because your ethnicity in Rwanda or in Burundi is determined by who your father is. And even if your Tutsi father marries a Hutu wife and you're the son of both or the daughter of both, you are a Tutsi. It's a patrilineal system. And if you have a system of that type, a bipolar system like that, it's impossible to ever break it. We have, in this society, thank goodness, what we call ambilateral kinship. You ask the average American, well, you know, what's your background? They'll say, well, you know, a little German here, you know, and a little English, and if they're honest, a little African American, a little Native American, who knows what. And it's, in other words, a mix. That's our melting pot country, and it's why we think of kinship that way in this country. And it's been one of the reasons that I think America is one of the least likely countries now. It wasn't before, when Indians had no vote, but it's one of the least likely countries now to actually commit genocide within its own borders, at least. It is a primary method for dividing society. This is an example in Rwanda. The Belgians believed a really crazy theory that was invented by Spies, that the Tutsi nobility were descendants of the lost Israelite tribe of Ham. I know, that's really crazy, but that's what they believed, and so therefore they said, we will rule Rwanda and Burundi indirectly using the Tutsi nobility. But in order to do that, we've got to figure out who's Tutsi and who's Hutu. So, literally, they went around measuring noses, looking at eyes, counting cattle, so forth, and then handed out ID cards to everybody to say you're Tutsi, or you're Hutu, or you're Twa, which are pygmies. How do you prevent that? Well, here it is. You transcend the classifications. That's what we do here in this country when we say we are Americans, instead of saying we are white, or we are black, or we are this, or we are that. It's what we do, and that's where we transcend through national identity. Religious classifications can be transcended. Instead of saying, oh, we're Catholics, or we're Protestants, we say we're Christians. Or, for that matter, you can all say, well, in the whole Abrahamic tradition, we're all in the Abrahamic tradition. We're Muslims, we're Jews, we're Christians. In other words, you transcend these divisions. And of course, my favorite one to transcend all the divisions is human. I used to have a lot of fun when I was a Fulbright professor in Swaziland, where I'd ever cross into South Africa to work on this new constitution for South Africa. And I always had to fill out a form and it had race on it. And I'd always just write human. You can imagine what the out-of-counter border guards thought of that. Well, they would cross it out and they'd write Caucasian, you know, and I would say, no, I'm not from the Caucasus. Another way to transcend is using common languages. Now, Tanzania has very consciously done that by adopting Swahili as its lingua franca. It's gradually happening, in fact, around the world, the adoption of English. But there are many other kinds of languages. Science is a language. One of the best ways in which we've been able to communicate with Iran, I know this sounds crazy, but has been through the continuation of scientific exchanges. I don't mean nuclear exchanges, but I mean other kinds of scientific exchanges, because there's still plenty of them. Another language is music. Do you remember when the New York Philharmonic played in Pyongyang, North Korea? And when the Chinese started to bring their culture to the United States, and how much that broke down the barriers between us. And of course, sports. Everyone knows about the Olympics. I love the Olympics. I wish we kind of get away a little bit from the nationalism in them, but they are nevertheless one of those places where everybody can identify themselves as human. We also should, and I think this is very important when you have people like Milosevic around, actively oppose racist and divisive politicians and parties. When you see them rising, you've got to stop it. We've been on this, for example, in South Africa very recently in the last few years. There's been a man named Julius Malema who has been a supporter of the current president of South Africa, helped overthrow President Mbeki. But Julius Malema is a racist. He's a Marxist racist. And his answer for South Africa is to essentially adopt the policies of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Throw the whites off the land, drive them out, and he even started to go around singing a song that he's entitled, and I'm not kidding, Kill the Boer, Kill the Afrikaner. Well, that was determined to be hate speech when he was prosecuted for it by a South African court. He's just ignored that and has fought it, but unfortunately it was the beginning of the end. He's now been kicked out of the African National Congress. He's protesting that, he's trying to fight it, but basically his political career is over. So that's the kind of thing you have to do when you have this kind of racist politician who's rising. Now, stage 2 in this process is symbolization. We need to symbolize our classifications or we can't even talk about it. One way is to use words. So, of course, German and Jew, those are words. Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. Because we use language, we have to give names to things. We also can classify people by their languages, and that's a kind of a natural type of classification, if you will. You could tell who was Armenian in Anatolia in 1915 because they spoke Armenian. In the Bangladesh genocide, a lot of people don't even know what happened. In 1971, 3 million people in Bangladesh were slaughtered by people from West Pakistan. There, the language differs between Urdu and Bengali. Another way, of course, are types of clothing. In Iraq, you could tell the difference between an Arab and a Kurd because of the way they dressed. That was self-imposed. So also in Southwest Africa, during the genocide against the Herero, the Germans dressed a certain way and the Herero dressed another way. Some things are self-adopted. Uniforms, the swastika armbands of the Nazi Party in Germany. And here, this white power armband, of course, is of the Aryan nations here in the United States. When you see this type of symbolization, watch out. Sometimes the colors and the religious symbols are imposed by the force that is intended to commit genocide. The most famous examples are the yellow star in Nazi Germany, and now the blue and white check scarf in Cambodia, which Ben Kieran and I discovered in the 1980s. We were going around interviewing people, and we found out that the Khmer Rouge had decided that the eastern zone of Cambodia was just full of people who were traitors. They said they had Khmer bodies, but Vietnamese heads. They were too close to Vietnam, you see. So they decided to deport them all to other parts of Cambodia and work them to death. And being the anthropologist that I am, asking silly questions, I guess, I asked them, well, did they give you new clothing? And they said, yes, they did when we were brought up the river. And I said, well, what color were the clothes? And they said, well, you know, the ones we wore for labor were the usual black pajama type looking clothing. And then I said, no, I mean the chroma, the scarf. Because all Cambodians wear these scarves. They're very useful against the sun and a lot of other things. They said, oh yes. They were blue and white. And a chill went through me when I heard that, because I knew blue was the color of the anti-communist resistance. And then I asked the question, was anyone else allowed to wear these? Blue, white, check, scarf? Oh no. So what other colors were worn by people? And they said, oh, red and white, black and white, and so forth. Were you allowed to wear those? Oh no, we had to wear the blue and white check scarves all the time. And then I asked the fatal question, and what did it mean? And they said, it was the killing sign. We had discovered the yellow star in Cambodia. This is one of the famous ID cards that was used in Rwanda. This woman was murdered. This is her card, and it shows that she was a Tutsi. Sorry. She's a Tutsi. And you see, the others are crossed out. So when they pulled her out of a vehicle, they took her to the side of the road, and they hacked her to death on the head. Simply because she had this card. Simply because she was Tutsi. In Nazi Germany, the Nazis required that the yellow star be adopted all across Europe by 1941. So what do you do about symbolization? Because there are definite things you can do about it. Well, first of all, you try to get the ethnic and religious and other types of identities that can become genocidal removed from ID cards, passports, and other official documents. A lot of people in this country forget that we actually had race on driver's licenses until the beginning part of the 20th century. I mean, it was finally ruled to be unconstitutional to do that. But, you know, to have that right on the driver's license is not exactly helpful. And also, to protest the imposition of marking symbols on targeted groups. when the Taliban in 2001 announced that all Hindus, remember this is a Muslim country, all Hindus in that society in Afghanistan were going to have to start wearing a yellow piece of cloth on their clothing. Genocide Watch and the whole international campaign to end genocide just raised hell. We contacted every UN delegate we could, every government we could. We had congressmen walking around Congress with yellow patches of cloth on their suits. We had people walking around the UN with yellow patches of cloth. We protested directly to the Afghan embassy and to all of the officials in Afghanistan. They backed down within a week. They never did in public. You gotta act fast sometimes on these things. And you also, of course, have to protest the use of racist words for groups. Words like these that I have up. You work to make them culturally unacceptable. It's not enough to outlaw them, because outlawing is usually not good enough because they'll find equivalent euphemism and just use the euphemism. The third stage, and this is one of the two new ones, because somebody pointed out to me that I needed this intermediary stage to really get to the fourth, is discrimination. It also doesn't necessarily lead to genocide, but it is a big step toward it. Segregation and apartheid, of course, were systematic forms of discrimination that we experienced both here in the United States and in South Africa. You separate the groups. You prohibit voting by members of the victim group. You fire the group that you're going to target from the professions. First thing the Nazis did in 1933 was fire all the Jewish professors in the universities and all the Jewish civil servants. You require passes to travel. In Germany, if you traveled and you were Jewish, you had to have a Reisepass, and it had a J on it. It meant Jew. You know who insisted that that be done? The Swiss. Because so many Jews were, in fact, escaping across the border into Switzerland, and the Swiss didn't want the Jews to come into Switzerland, and so they demanded that the German government put the J on the Reisepass. So, don't ever consider the Swiss sort of really neutral during the Second World War. They also financed the Nazis. Discrimination can also include the boycotting of businesses. Here we have Nazi stormtroopers actually barring the entrance to a Jewish business. What do you do about discrimination? Well, one thing is, of course, outlaw it. That's what we did with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made it illegal in public accommodations, in restaurants, and so forth, to segregate the facilities, or on buses, for instance, to segregate the buses. We had a general law that outlawed all of that whole system. There were motels where you could not stay if you were white. Well, that was all outlawed by that act. It was a very important development in our history. Secondly, you pass laws that protect universal voting rights. Many people could say that our country was not really a full democracy until the 1960s. And the reason for that is the 19th Amendment had not yet been passed that gave the vote to women. That's probably the most important of all. I happen to have a personal interest in that because one of my ancestors was Gregory Stanton. And in 1924, finally Indians were allowed to vote in the Indian Citizenship Act. And in 1966, the Voting Rights Act finally brought the reality of voting into the South. I was one of the voting rights workers who went down there and helped people register to vote. And believe me, we were followed around by the Ku Klux Klan. You talk about a terrorist organization, that was that was one of them. They shot at our house, they wounded a couple of my friends. I still tell people, when they ask me, where were the most dangerous places you ever lived? I say, Mississippi, 1966. You also make anti-discrimination laws enforceable in independent courts by private parties. It's called the private right of action. In other words, you don't just wait to have the Attorney General of the state bring a case under an anti-discrimination law. You let an individual bring the case if he or she has been discriminated against because of their gender or because of their race or whatever. And you also take these discriminatory categories off the effects. Now, the fourth stage, dehumanization, is really where the genocidal spiral starts down with virulent facts. This is where you actually try to deny the humanity of the other group. You make the victim group seem subhuman. Now, the reason why this is so important as a stage is because dehumanization removes the revulsion against murder that is present in all legal systems. If you can convince yourself that people you're killing aren't really people, then of course it's not murder. And this was exactly what the Nazis did here. This is a poster from Der Stürmer, a Nazi newspaper, that shows the image of a Jew as sort of a devil. And this says, the blood flows, the Jew grins. This is a newspaper in Rwanda that says, this is the solution for the Tutsi cockroaches. Notice, here's a Tutsi. This is the solution. Machetes. They shipped in over 500,000 machetes just 3 months before the Rwandan genocide in April of 1994. General Bipolar learned about these machetes, asked permission to confiscate them because they were in direct violation of the UN embargo on arms, and he was turned down by Iqbal Riza and Kofi Annan at the UN, who said it exceeded his mandate to do so. During dehumanization, you blame staged attacks on the targeted traitors, such as the Reichstag fire, which was blamed on Jews, Jewish communists, in fact, in 1933. You attack cultural centers of the targeted groups. This is a synagogue that was destroyed. A lot of them were burned. And in fact, Kristallnacht also, of course, was an attack on lots of Jewish businesses in 1938. And these are the tactics of dehumanization. You can find this hate propaganda in speeches, in print, on hate radio. Hate radio was particularly important in Rwanda. The victim group is described, if you hear these kinds of words, watch out. It's described as animals, vermin, diseases. In Rwanda, the Tutsi were described as cockroaches. And here's a quote from the hate radio in Rwanda. If this disease is not treated immediately, it will destroy all of Hutu. The whole strategy here is the superiority of the us, your group, against the inferiority of the other. Now, in some cases, of course, you'll also find use of euphemisms. This is one of Milosevic's favorite tactics. He invented the term ethnic cleansing. A lot of people don't know he invented this term. And it's actually even made it into some UN resolutions, which I found amazing. Because actually, what it is forced deportation. Forced deportation is a crime against humanity. Milosevic called it ethnic cleansing, and somehow people didn't really pay attention. So how do you prevent dehumanization? Well, you vigorously protest the use of dehumanizing words when you hear them. When you hear people referred to as filth or vermin or animals or diseases, you scream bloody murder. And you also deny those people visas, you freeze their foreign assets and their contributions. I mean, really, most of the genocides have gotten support from overseas. And so if you can freeze their assets, from the expatriates from that country, you will be doing a great service in preventing the genocide. Basically, when they froze the assets of the IRA in the United States, it shut down the IRA. And similarly, you can do other things that are like that in other situations. You prosecute hate crimes. It's very important to prosecute hate crimes. Hate crimes are the leading edge of genocide because they express the same intent. They themselves are not genocide, but they are the precursors of genocide. You jam or you shut down the hate radio and the television stations where there's a danger of genocide. Now, when I got back to work on the Rwanda genocide in the State Department in 1994, and they asked me to, sort of do cleanup, if you will, because I was only brought back in July of '94 when most of it was over. The first thing I did was I went around and asked people, why on earth didn't we jam the radio? And a CIA person actually said to me, and I quote you, because it would have been a violation of freedom of speech. Well, incitement to commit a crime is not protected speech in any legal system that I know. I was a constitutional law professor, and I can tell you that simply was an example of a little knowledge being a dangerous thing. Also, we had lawyers in the State Department who said it would have violated some kind of international treaties on free communications and so forth. Well, which is more important, international treaties on free communications or the prevention of genocide? I ask you. It would have cost us, is the real reason. That was what was really it came down to. I was told it cost $8,000 an hour to fly the plane over Rwanda that would have jammed the radio station. Now, you calculate that out. The Rwandan genocide killed 800,000 people. The Rwandan genocide lasted for 100 days. There were 24 hours in a day. If it cost $8,000 per hour to fly that plane over Rwanda during those 100 days, how much did we value each human life? I would ask you to get out your calculators and do it. I'll just tell you. It's just a little over $20. You can also do positive prevention. You can prevent by humanizing the others. This is something that Search for Common Ground especially specializes in. It's an anti-conflict, anti-genocide group that we work with. You provide programs for tolerance for radio, TV, and newspapers. You enlist religious and political leaders to speak out and educate for tolerance. You have organized inter-ethnic, interfaith, interracial groups to work against hatred. There's been a huge program of training for leadership in Burundi, for instance, that I believe has really kept that country from falling back over the cliff into genocide. And you build local anti-genocide alliances. The fifth stage is organization. You've got to have organization because genocide is a group crime. Genocide is not some guy walking into a McDonald's with a machine gun and killing 15 people. Genocide is when you have a real planned final solution that is planned by usually the government, but it can be also planned by a hate group. Plans are made by elites for a final solution, and we know of plans that were made in Rwanda. We know of plans that have been made in Sudan. We know of the planning in Germany for the Holocaust. I will even show you some of that because that one was the most obvious because we've actually got the transcript of the Wannsee Conference where they did the planning for the Holocaust. In the organization stage, often you can organize militias that will do a lot of the killing. You know, it means you don't have to organize a whole army. You don't have to use your whole army. You can actually just get common people to participate. And some people estimate that in the Rwandan genocide, at least 100,000 people, maybe 200, actually participated in the killing. You can imagine, I mean, it takes a lot of people to kill 800,000 people in 100 days. Government, businessmen, the Hutu power movement provided these militias with machetes and training camps, and created an ideology of what you could call self-defense, saying that the Tutsi were going to kill them, so they better kill the Tutsi first. What do you do about it? Well, first of all, you should treat these kinds of groups as organized crime groups. We have got the RICO statute in the United States. A lot of you probably know about how effective it's been in shutting down the mafia in an awful lot of places. Because we can move in now and sweep down and literally seize all the property of an entire mafia family all at once. It's that type of effective organizational strategy you need to have if you're going to take down a hate group. It's what happened when finally Robert F. Kennedy demanded finally that J. Edgar Hoover, who was a racist, infiltrate the Ku Klux Klan. It eventually brought the Klan down. And it also, of course, the Southern Poverty Law Center has done wonders to sue the Klan into complete bankruptcy. You deny visas to leaders of hate groups and freeze their foreign assets. A lot of people think, oh, that's sort of, technical, will that work? Well, the truth is, foreign leaders like to travel, and so do their wives. Their wives especially. Their wives like to go to London and Paris and, buy nice outfits and everything else. If you freeze all their assets, they can't do that. They don't like that one bit. You also impose arms embargoes on these hate groups and these governments. When I first came in to working on these issues in the State Department, no arms embargo had ever been effective. And I asked myself, why? And I then realized, as a lawyer, I said, well, what do you need to make a law effective? Well, the first thing you need is a police force. You need someone to investigate and find out who's committing the crime. So, I wrote a resolution. It's UN Security Council Resolution 1113, I think, that created the Central African Arms Flow Commission. And that particular resolution finally proved that arms were being shipped into the genocidaires, the people who committed the genocide in Rwanda, and we got the names on the manifest of 2 whole planeloads of guns that had been shipped into Goma in June of 1994. And guess who signed the manifest? Baroness Bagasora himself, the leader of the genocide, who apparently also flew in with these arms. This was used in his trial at the ICTR. He's now in prison for life. And that strategy has now been used again and again at the UN. The 6th stage is polarization, where you drive the groups apart. The hate groups broadcast and print polarizing propaganda. You're either with us or you're against us. This is what particularly worried me about the polarization that seemed to be affecting the United States recently. I think we've drawn back somewhat from it. But when Gabby Giffords was shot, I really realized just how dangerous this was getting. I think actually that shocked a lot of people enough that they realized they did need to draw back from it. But that type of polarization, which essentially penalizes the moderates, drives them out, is a real technique of genocide. Now remember that my model is not linear. You don't have to have first number 1, then 2, then 3, and 4, and 5. A lot of these processes are simultaneous. A lot of them go along with each other. But the key thing here is you've got to somehow get rid of the moderates if you want to commit a genocide, especially the moderates from your own group. So the first people to be arrested in Germany, for instance, were the liberal Catholic priests, the Social Democrats, the liberal Protestant pastors, and the communists, all of whom opposed Hitler. What do you do to prevent polarization? Well, you depolarize. You vigorously protest laws or policies that segregate or marginalize groups or deprive whole groups of citizenship rights. If you find somebody who's depriving a whole group of citizenship rights the way Bashir has just deprived all South Sudanese of their citizenship in Sudan, that's 2 million people who live up near Khartoum. That, folks, is a very big sign that something terrible is about to happen. And of course, it's happening again and again in Sudan. He's on his 4th genocide already. He's bombing the Nubian Mountains and the Blue Nile region. Apartheid Bantustans were another example where you needed to oppose that kind of polarization. In the Ivory Coast, they had a policy that they called Ivoirization. In other words, they would only treat really native-born Ivorians as truly citizens of the United Coast, but they defined it in such a way that you had to have 3 generations to be a truly native-born Ivorian. And they tried to essentially exclude fully a third of the population, and that is why the country was then torn apart. To oppose this, you physically protect moderate leaders. When the Burundi peace talks were underway, led by Nelson Mandela, he said, you know, you have on both sides, Tutsi side and Hutu side, extremists who would like to kill the moderate leaders who are doing these negotiations. So, we're going to provide you with protection. And guess who is going to protect you? The South African Army and police. So we'll bring up, by this time the apartheid was over, they brought up some of the most effective police in Africa. And they kept all of those negotiators alive. You demand release of moderate leaders. That's why the work of Amnesty International is so important. Juan Mendez, who became later the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, was a political prisoner in Argentina under the general. And it was Amnesty International that got him free. You oppose coup d'etat. The 7th stage is conspiracy. It's planning. It's preparation. This is the Wannsee Villa, right near, well, at the edge of Berlin, where the Nazi leaders, Heydrich and Eichmann, planned the final solution to the Jewish question on the 20th of January 1942. HBO made an incredible movie of this called Conspiracy. And it is literally based on the only surviving transcript of that meeting. It's amazing that these Nazis would actually have a court reporter sitting down there, taking down every word that was said at that meeting. They tried to destroy all the copies of the transcripts, but one survived, and that was the basis on which they made this movie. It is one of the most chilling movies you will ever see. But it shows how the German leadership actually planned the Holocaust. During the preparation stage, you finally impose the identifying symbols, these yellow stars, for instance. You force the victim groups to wear the identification symbols. And that was what they did in most places. Not everywhere, though. Very interesting. In Bulgaria, the president of Bulgaria and also the head of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church refused to distribute the yellow stars. They said, no, our people are Bulgarians. They are not Jews or Christians. They're Bulgarians. And we are not going to distribute your damn yellow stars. The result was only 3% of the Bulgarian Jews were killed. The other famous example, of course, is Denmark, where they literally smuggled all the Jews out of Denmark across the straits to Sweden, and also the Germans never even tried to impose the yellow star because it was famously said that the Danish king said if they tried, he'd be the first to wear one. If you can completely, of course, make a symbol meaningless that way, you have defeated it. The other big stage, of course, in preparation is the military buildup. This is what the Nazis did. This is the 19th Panzer Division. It was all built in complete violation of the Versailles Treaty. The militarization of Germany, the taking over the Sudetenland, all of the other things that Hitler did were complete violations of the Versailles Treaty, which they considered unjust, but which were, of course, obstacles to his plan to take over Europe. So what do you do about this stage of preparation? Well, if you've got this kind of evidence that you've got death lists, you've got arms shipments, you've got militia training, you've got trial massacres and so forth, you've got to really declare genocide work. And I mean a serious genocide work. Genocide's on its way. The UN Security Council should warn the nation involved that it will take action, but it should only do that if it really means it. If it really means it's going to take action. If it's just going to do like it did with Darfur and pass resolution after resolution after resolution, none of which were ever enforced, it's actually making the situation worse. The UN has proven to be completely ineffective as a preventer of genocide. And it is just, as I said, because of the nature of the UN. I don't think it's a hopeless organization at all. Sometimes it does help a little. Certainly helps with refugees and with humanitarian aid, and I think in a lot of other fields. World Health Organization is very important and so forth. I'm not against the UN. But I just think that in prevention of genocide, it is not the answer. The world leaders must warn the potential perpetrators. They'll be tried for their crimes. Prue-Bushnell tried to do that directly with Bipolar during the Rwandan genocide. He just laughed. Well, we got it, didn't we? Just as, what can I say? I started to say, the Cambodian delegation to the UN warned me by telephone after we denounced the creation of the Cambodian Genocide Project that if I went forward with that, they were going to kill me. That's a quote. It was directly from Jim Prasit, the ambassador from Cambodia, who was Khmer Rouge. My answer to him is, we will get you first. And we did, too. Humanitarian relief should be prepared because you're going to have a disaster. And regional military intervention forces should be organized, and you've got to support them with the logistics in place. I'm convinced regional military forces are the best answer right now that we've got to genocide. NATO, if you could get the Arab League to finally act together, for instance, that could be incredibly important in solving the Syrian crisis. What if they set up, for instance, an international tribunal formed by the Arab League to try the war crimes and crimes against humanity now being committed in Syria? Doesn't have to be done by the UN. What if they had an Arab force that actually intervened? So I'm convinced there are really, and there are other good examples. ECOWAS in Africa, the Economic Community of West African States, really put an end to the Sierra Leone and Liberia genocide. Stage 8 is persecution. This is my other stage that I added in because it's just an escalation of course, the preparation stage, but it is an escalation into the point where you're almost having the extermination. You separate the victims because of their ethnic or religious identity, you expropriate their property, you displace them from their homes, you force them into ghettos, sometimes you march them across deserts, the way they did with the Armenians in 1915. And then finally, you've got the actual genocide. This is stage 9. You know, the thing that really gets me sometimes about genocide studies is lawyers have sort of taken control of the discipline. And so they'll say, oh no, this is not yet genocide, so let's not use the word. Well, Genocide Watch doesn't agree with that. We think the word should be used a lot more often, and that in fact we should start talking about the precursors to genocide, so that we will be able to prevent it That's why we've developed this process model. But here is where it actually becomes genocide legally. The mass killing begins. Now, most of it's committed by governments. This is a group of Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi killing squads in Eastern Europe. It started the genocide against the Jews. And although a lot of it's government-sponsored, it can also work in conjunction with local militias. This bottom picture is of Ukrainian militias that are helping the Nazis kill Jews. And of course, up above, we have the Interahamwe actually killing Tutsis in Rwanda. Now, the people who commit genocide, this is the worst thing of all, actually believe they're doing good. They believe that this extermination is cleansing the society of impurities, of disease, of animals, of vermin, of cockroaches, or of enemies. As Pascal said, the great French philosopher, there is nothing so evil as one who does evil thinking he is doing good. And that is exactly what happens in genocide. The Roma were singled out by the Nazis and, of course, pretty much wiped out in most of Germany, for instance. And the concentration camps were full of them, and they killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them. These are Jewish women who are being massacred in Ukraine in 1942 by the SS directly. This is the finishing up of the massacre in 1942. What a horrible, horrible picture. And this is, can you believe this? This is an Einsatzgruppen commando actually shooting the last Jew left alive in this town of Vinica, Ukraine in 1942. Oh man, inhumanity, man, it's just amazing. Of course, the Nazis took it a step forward, even farther, because they had mechanized massacre. They built extermination camps, like this one. And they also called them labor camps to disguise them. They transported the victims to the camps by train. It was an entirely coordinated system. They killed them, and then they cremated them. And these are the crematoria. And any time a genocide denier, a Nazi Holocaust denier, tells you that there were no crematoria, just go to Europe and see them yourself, because they're still there. These are the Buchenwald death camp crematoria. This is the Chungak mass grave that I was one of the first people, non-Cambodians, to see in 1980. It had just been excavated. They just dug up about 7,000 bodies from this mass grave, which was the place where they buried the victims from the Tool Slang S-21 prison in Cambodia. And that prison was run by the famous Comrade Deutsch, who has now been convicted of genocide and of crimes against humanity by the Cambodian tribunal, by the Gregory Tribunal. But these pictures were ones I took in 1980 before the bones were reburied and given proper Buddhist ceremonies. So what do you do about this? How do you stop extermination? Well, first of all, I think you need a regional army to begin the intervention. It's got to be led by a power that has enough power to actually do something to stop it. The UN Security Council should then authorize that use of force, and should do so under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which is the chapter that allows intervention against the will of the government that is in charge of their country. And if it is paralyzed, and I know this is a heretical view for an international lawyer to say, the regional force should still go ahead and stop it. The mandate, and I've written a number of these mandates for UN Security Council resolutions for peacekeeping operations, has got to be robust. It's got to include protection of civilians and humanitarian workers, and it's got to include a no-fly zone. Forget about observer missions. They're worse than nothing. Rules of engagement for the forces have to include prevention of killing, not just in self-defense, but of all civilians. They've got to be really tough. You can't just send people in, and say, well, if you're fired upon, you can shoot back. If UN forces or regional forces are authorized to go in, they have got to be able to stop the killing and actually shoot the people who are doing the killing. I'm sorry I'm not a pacifist. I really am in favor of nonviolent resistance in most cases. I think it's by far the best way to overthrow tyrants. But I think that in the case where you've got extermination already going on, the only way to stop it is by force. The major military powers have got to provide leadership, logistics, airlift, communications, and finance for this. Because you can't do it if you've just got Fiji or Bangladesh or some other countries coughing up troops because they can get paid to go into a country. They won't have the resources to do the job. And then finally, and I left this out when I first thought up this model, but I finally realized that there's another stage, stage 10, denial. Denial occurs during and after every genocide. Barbara Harf has shown in her studies that it more than triples the likelihood of another genocide in that country if there has been impunity, if everybody has just done nothing about it. It extends the crime, too, because future generations of victims continue to be hurt by the crime. That is why it is so important that the United States and other countries recognize the Armenian genocide. Armenians continue to be hurt by this ignorance of the world, of what happened to them. And the tactics of denial are quite predictable. I'll just summarize them here. First, you attack the truth tellers. You say, well, look at what they did. They're our enemies. They murdered the Indians in America, so who are they to point their fingers at us? You deny or you minimize the evidence or the numbers. I actually went to a talk once in which Abby Hoffman talked. He's very entertaining. And I raised my hand at the end of it, and I said, I was very active in the anti-war movement during the 60s, but don't you think that those of us who are active in the anti-war movement should admit that we were wrong about Cambodia? The bloodbath really happened, and 1.7 million people were killed. And you know what his answer was? He said, oh, no, there wasn't 1.7 million people. There was only 700,000. Only 700,000? There was a gasp that went through the audience and said that. I didn't have to say anything else. But that's what the Turks always do. They try to minimize the numbers. You deny genocidal intent. You say it was a famine. You blame a civil or international war. That's, of course, the favorite Turkish denial technique. That it was during the World War. And so it really wasn't our fault. You also blame the victims. You say that the Armenians were a disloyal minority in the middle of it, so we had to do something. You deny the facts fit the legal definition of genocide. This is one of my favorites as a lawyer, of course, and let me tell you, there's lots of ways to do that. You claim that the genocide would harm the peace process. And finally, you claim that the genocide, that you say that the claim of genocide would harm your current interests. That's a very big, because, for instance, it's why the Russians and the Chinese don't want to have what's going on in Sudan named genocide, because they're selling arms and they're getting oil from Sudan. We don't want to call the Armenian genocide in Turkey because we have a huge air base there. So this one is a particularly cynical one. What do you do about denial? Well, I believe the best thing is to arrest and try the perpetrators of the genocide in international, domestic, or mixed courts. You create truth commissions to document the facts about the genocide and publish them. You hold public truth and reconciliation forums for neighbors to confess and apologize. These are the gotcha courts in Rwanda. You incorporate education about genocide in the curriculum of every secondary school. You make films and radio programs for the public. In short, you have to have a vast education program. I believe, and this is what the whole program of Genocide Watch and the International Alliance to End Genocide is about. I believe we need an international mass movement to end genocide. I think that it has to come from the bottom up. Our governments aren't going to stop it. We've got to demand that they stop it. We've got to organize civil society and human rights groups. We've got to mobilize religious leaders of churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples to demand that genocide not happen. We've put genocide education into the curriculum of every secondary school and university in this country and all around the world. And it's possible. Rwanda's done it. New Jersey's done it. I mean, seriously, there are a lot of states that have done it now. If New Jersey can do it, surely our order. You hold the political leaders accountable. If they fail to act to stop genocide, vote them out of office. So why isn't that even more important, than whether or not they keep the economy healthy? I don't know. But this is where we get to the other big question. And this is where Paul Slovic's research is so important. And so I end with this slide of my 10-week-old West Highland Terrier puppy. And the name of this slide, Save the Darfur Puppy, comes from a very famous column that was written by Nick Kristof that was based on Paul Slovic's research, in which Nick Kristof showed that Paul Slovic's research proved that people could be motivated to actually take action, to do something, when they saw that it would help one person or two people, but that reaction would drop to almost nothing if it was to help 10,000 people. Why is it that we are so in need to caring about this kind of mass killing? Well, that is exactly what Paul is researching, why he's so interesting as a scholar to me. He has really got some interesting theories about it, and so I'm going to now end and ask Paul to come up and help me answer questions. Thank you. Yes.
Torture. And what I found is that our National Security Act pretty much overrides our Constitution, creates a junta, and that now compounded by the Patriot Act, we've now set up a situation where we have specifically an us and them sort of legal ball field or playing field.
I agree.
It seems like everything's setting up to lead right down the gullet.
I really agree with you. I think with the Patriot Act and some of the more recent decisions of courts that actually legalize the killing of Americans, extrajudicial killing of Americans, are inimical to our Constitution. I completely agree with you. I think it's horrifying, and I think that, well, as they say, during war, the law is ignored. And that seems to be what's happening. Yes.
Just in connection with that, the Phoenix program was developed in South America when Kennedy sent all our intelligence personnel to Southeast Asia. It was implemented by William Colby, but it was developed by James J. Angleton. And what it did is it said that we should specifically just kill non-combatant civilians.
That's
and
right.
they actually paid by the year to have those people killed. Now that was immediately before the Khmer Rouge came along. You think the Khmer Rouge looking around their neighborhood and saying that other people seem to act this way, maybe it would work for us too? Bill Bolton isn't one who made the list for Suharto to kill 1 million people.
I know that, and I also know that we knew full well that the Indonesian regime was about to kill 500,000 people in the 60s. And Kissinger actually gave them a green light. So our hands are not clean, you're absolutely right. And we have all the dangers. You know, there's this famous book, I think it's Sinclair Lewis, called It Can't Happen Here. Well, it can happen here. You're right.
Could there be a separate United Nations just focusing on genocide and have its own separate Security Council? And it would constantly be looking around for the possibility of genocide. And it happens. You said 70 million people died from this?
That's correct.
And how many died in wars? A lot less than that, right?
Yes, since then,
It
yes.
seems like a more important problem. And they would just constantly bring to mind all the things that you said.
Actually, Paul and I have discussed this somewhat. There's actually, you should read the UN Charter very carefully. There's actually a provision in the UN Charter that provides for what would be essentially a new constitutional convention to create a new UN Charter. And it could be done. We could remove the Pearl 5 veto, for example. But it'd be very hard politically to achieve this. And so that's why what you're suggesting, sort of doing an end run on the UN, isn't such a bad idea. And that's effectively what we've done with the International Criminal Court. We've created an Assembly of States Parties, which now has 130 members. And that International Criminal Court has the jurisdiction to try crimes in any of its member parties or by any of the citizens of its member parties, including genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and soon also aggression. And my view is that the next thing we need to do for the ICC, for the International Criminal Court, is to have an optional protocol to that statute to create an international police force to carry out the arrest warrants that are approved by the pretrial chamber of the International Criminal Court. I'm not advocating a generalized police force that can just go run around and, arrest anybody who wants to. I'm saying if they've been indicted and there's an arrest warrant put out for them by the International Criminal Court, there should be a police force to actually enforce it. Right now they have to depend on national police forces, and it hasn't worked very well. So there surely are ways to, I think, be creative about what we could do to get around, frankly, the ineffectiveness of the UN. Yeah.
I was just wondering, you talked a lot about how lawyers and different people want to classify various events as genocide for various reasons. And I was wondering how you would qualify Japanese internment camps during World War II, in that obviously they weren't going there to kill, but they were separated and they basically their lives were ruined because they would have homes to evacuate themselves.
I think the Japanese internment camps, which, by the way, as you may know, were actually upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States in one of the worst decisions they ever wrote. I do not think they were genocide, because the objective was not to destroy the groups. But I do believe that insofar as they were systematically discriminatory against American citizens who were Japanese, that they were violations of our Constitution, our 14th Amendment, and also violations, I think, of the basic principles of human rights that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration. So agree that I think they were terrible, and I don't think they were genocide in the sense that they weren't killing the Japanese yet.
Similar question. You mentioned that forced deportation of a specific group qualifies as genocide.
No. Forced deportation is a different crime. It is a crime against humanity, but it's not genocide. Forced deportation, where you actually try to push a group out of its territory, like putting Indians on reservations, for instance, is not itself genocide. However, keep this in mind, it can be accompanied by genocide. In other words, both things can happen at the same time. So, for example, when we had the Trail of Tears with the Cherokees, there was both genocide and forced deportation. When Milosevic and the Serbs drove the Kosovar Albanians out of Kosovo, that was both genocide and forced deportation. So in other words, they aren't mutually exclusive, but they also aren't congruent. So you don't always have genocide when you have forced deportation.
I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about the current situation in the United States with illegal immigrants.
Very good. I'm glad you brought that up. Every time I hear the words illegal aliens, I ask myself, or the person who's used the words, what planet do you think they come from? Because you see, it is one of the more dehumanizing terms that you could ever think of to describe a human being. Illegal aliens? My view on that is we should remember that we're a nation of immigrants. What happened to this? I think it is terrible that we have gotten to be so nativistic that we are so afraid of people coming from Mexico or Central America and so forth because they want jobs. You know what? My ancestors came to this country because they wanted jobs too. And there weren't any immigration laws then. It's just they came in the 1600s. And so, it was completely legal. And we had basically no immigration laws at all until, the beginning of the 20th century. So we had a really huge flow of immigrants coming into the United States. I think we need a rational immigration law system in the United States. I'm not favoring open borders because I think we'd have 500,000 Americans very quickly if we had open borders. But I do think that we need a rational immigration system. We need to legalize the immigrants who are here now. And we should stop this dehumanizing language of talking about illegal aliens.
So that whole row of students there, I think you're going to get to chat with tomorrow, right?
Okay. Yes.
Our observation is that bureaucracies never move quickly, and the UN is a bureaucracy. And the other is that changing laws and creating legal structures is slow.
It is. You're right.
Action is possible without having to obey the laws. Now, I know you're trained as a lawyer, but
You're right.
if you also were involved in the civil rights movement, civil disobedience is when you ignore the laws that allow injustice to happen. Seems like part of this grassroots. What if all of the peacekeepers in Rwanda had refused to leave? In other words, they had disobeyed the order to leave because they saw that a genocide would happen. How would you prosecute them?
You wouldn't.
What crime would you prosecute them for that civil disobedience? I think that maybe there is too much respect for law.
I completely agree with that. In fact, the Ghanaian general, who was the deputy commander of UNAMIR in Rwanda, advocated that very course of action. He told General Dallaire they should simply disobey the order. And General Dallaire was very open to doing that. But unfortunately, General Dallaire had General Gabriel, who was his superior in the Canadian military, also over him in the UN. In other words, it was going to affect General Dallaire's entire career, whatever it did. But
It did anyway.
But it did, yes, you're right, because he then had terrible post-traumatic stress disorder, he tried to commit suicide, all kinds of things. He blamed it on himself. He should never blame it on himself. I know him very, very well. He's a member of our board of advisors. And I've sat and talked with him for hours about this. But I agree with you completely that this type of action, mass action by citizens, can have huge impact. I can tell you another example of it. In Ukraine, when I was legal advisor in the Ukrainian independence movement, they simply declared that, our mass meetings in the center of Kiev were illegal. And they, threatened to arrest us, but they never did it. So we just kept having the meetings. And we also started a march up to the prison every day. And they said that was illegal too, and they never did anything about that. Eventually they freed the people who were in prison. And then they came to me one day, I remember this vividly. And they said, tomorrow they're really going to crack down, so you're sure you want to speak? And so I thought a little bit about it, and I went over to the American consulate. There was one. And do you have a copy of the Declaration of Independence in Ukrainian? Yes. So I got up there and read the first 3 paragraphs of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Have you ever read them well? About the right of the people to overthrow tyrannical governments? The people went crazy when I read them. They said, yes, that is exactly right. We need to overthrow this tyrannical government. It was amazing. I'll never forget it. It was one of the most electrifying moments of my life. And there we were saying these words beneath an 80-foot tall granite statue of Vladimir Lenin. Well, I watched that statue get taken down block by granite block just 2 years later. So, you're right. Popular action can have enormous impact.
I was just wondering, you were saying how in stage 4 you have to shut down hate radio and that sort of thing. So what about people such as Rush Limbaugh who clearly preach hate?
Pretty close.
Should we jam that?
You know what? The difference actually is this. In the situation in Rwanda, you really didn't have any free speech at all. In other words, there was no opportunity for alternative views to be expressed. It was only the view of the government because it was sponsoring the hate radio. And it was, in fact, a multiplier for the hate radio. There were no other radio stations. The difference in the United States is we do have a huge diversity of radio, television, and other opinions that are able to be expressed. And I'm enough of a Jeffersonian to believe that actually eventually the truth will out. That the Rush Limbaughs of the world will be seen as the jerks that they really are. Nevertheless, they do have an impact. I know they do. And I think they were among the most polarizing factors that led up to Gabby Giffords' shooting. So we have to watch out in this country too. I think you're right. I just think that we have to recognize them as, in fact, yes, they're hate radio type figures, and we're going to denounce them as that.